everyone, to the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm Glenda Rose, President of Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, here with State Archaeologist Dr. Sarah Sportman after a 3-month hiatus, and we are thrilled to be back. Today we have a unique opportunity to hear from a group of archaeologists and scholars who are working to steward the Indigenous cultural heritage of the Quinnipiac River Valley Region here in Connecticut. It will be interesting to hear about their project, the history of the Quinnipiac people, artifacts that exist, what's currently on display, and future plans for building the collections. We'll also learn about the Quinnipiac Dawnland Museum at Dudley Farm in Guilford. Be sure to visit the Dawnland Museum, and on a side note, I encourage all our listeners to seek out your local museums and historical societies, since we have so much history in our small state and a lot of great places to learn all about it. So join us for the next hour and enjoy the show. If you have a question during the show, please send a quick email to info@icrvradio.com. Here's Sarah to introduce our guests and begin the discussion.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be back here at ICRV after quite a few months off, actually. This is our first show of 2024. So for this episode, as Glenda said, we're going to be talking about the Quinnipiac River Valley Cultural Heritage Project. And it's an ambitious project, but an incredibly important effort, I think, to locate, identify, and steward the Indigenous cultural heritage of the Quinnipiac River Valley region in southern Connecticut. An area, and this is particularly tricky because this is an area where there's not currently an organized tribal group with whom to consult and collaborate. The goal of the project is to develop a collaborative framework for stewardship of the region's material cultural heritage that has been collected through years of artifact hunting and professional and avocational excavations, and it's stored in various repositories across the state. And, to do this in ways that are meaningful and respectful, but can also involve student and public engagement. Tonight we're going to be talking with a group of the dedicated people involved with this project, including historian Jim Powers from the Quinnipiac Dawnland Museum, and archaeologists Julia Giblin from Quinnipiac University, Bill Farley from Southern Connecticut State University, and Paul Wegner from the Institute for American Indian Studies. So excited to learn more about the project and the challenges and successes that you've all encountered. And, I'd like to also talk about some of the exhibits that have come out of this and that are related to this, because I think there might be some interest among our listeners for going to see some of that stuff. So maybe we can just start by doing a little bit of an introduction and then, maybe just tell us how you got involved with this project. And I guess we can start with Dr. Bill Farley, who's been on the show a number of times and should be a familiar voice to you all by now.
Yeah, that's a friend of the show and a long time. Yeah, that's been on a few times. I'm excited to be back, so thanks for having me. And the QRVP, the Quinnipiac River Valley Project, is I think still quite a loose framework at this point, and we'd like to see it continue to formalize. And it has some limited and more expansive goals, but I think it originally came out of a very pragmatic place, was having conversations with Paul, Julia, and other folks trying to work in the New Haven area and in and around New Haven, in places like Guilford and North Haven and West Haven and East Haven, towns like that, where, like Sarah mentioned, where, like Dr. Sportman mentioned in the beginning, there isn't an existing obvious structure for doing collaboration with Indigenous people. Like, say, if you're working in southeastern Connecticut, it's obvious you're going to be working with the Mohegan, you're going to be working with the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot. There's tribal groups that are, whether they're federally recognized or state recognized, there's a structure in place to do that. And that's a really important part of archaeological ethics. If we're dealing with Native American collections, we want to be doing collaboration with the descendant communities who are relevant to that. And there isn't an in place structure for that in the New Haven area. So we just started talking about how do we make that happen? Because archaeology is happening in those places as it sort of must legally, and has been happening for centuries at this point. How do we sort of accomplish that? And it really started just from, I think, that open question, and has evolved from there in a big way. So that's where I came into it, because I work primarily in Guilford and in the New Haven environs, and as just trying to do good collaborative and ethical archaeology, just trying to answer those practical questions. That's where I came into this.
Paul?
And I think, I can't even remember where I came into it. I think Julia, Dr. Giblin visited the museum at some point, and we started to work together to come up with some projects for students, and we're looking at some sites that were actually in Quinnipiac homelands, and ended up working with a site that we have within our collections at the Institute, which is Burwell Caraco, and started to have students look at that, and then wonder kind of what other sites we had and what other collections that we had in our legacy collections at the Institute that were related to Quinnipiac homelands and how they tied to other smaller organizations and those kind of things. And then that's when we kind of start to meet with Dr. Farley and Jim Powers and some people at Yale in a meeting that we had, and kind of start to formulate this idea. And that's pretty much it. It was just kind of came out of necessity in a sense. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jim Powers, and I'm Vice President of the Dudley Farm Museum in Guilford, where we recently opened the Quinnipiac Dawnland Museum this past September. And it's been quite an experience, only because what we had to work with was basically a lifelong 50-year collection of Quinnipiac artifacts. And part of the gifting of those artifacts to us was the idea that we would make these artifacts available to the public on a long-term basis. The problem we had was exactly how to do this, and I'll talk a little bit more later about the whole process of how we were able to create the museum with the idea that we wanted to be culturally sensitive and respectful to the Indigenous population of Connecticut, despite the fact that up to this point we have not been able to locate any actual descendants of the Quinnipiac people.
So this is Julia, and I think Bill did a great job of kind of framing this question that I think we all had, and ended up intersecting around that. I was wandering around the Institute for American Indian Studies one weekend with my family, and met Paul, and started, looking at the Burwell Caraco collection, and really came to this, as a professor at Quinnipiac University and also a resident of Brantford, both places on Quinnipiac homelands. What is my relationship to this place? What can I engage students, with in terms of the campus and surrounding areas? And how can I use my tools as an archaeologist to think about and explore that? And so part of it was looking kind of what has been done archaeologically and looking at that through these legacy collections. And then I was also working with a student, Daniel Galvez, to try to connect with descendants of the Quinnipiac. And that was a part of an initiative at Quinnipiac University called the Indigeneity Initiative. And we were collaborating with Akamat. And they had suggested that we do this work of really trying to build relationships with the Quinnipiac. And so we were trying to figure out if we could make those connections, and ended up reaching out to Brothertown Indian Nation in Wisconsin and doing some work there. But through that process ended up, really starting to have these conversations with Jim and Paul and Bill, and and it's been, I think, kind of organic in some ways, and also, I think to Bill's point, I think we're good at doing the sort of academic thing. We're all kind of trained to come up with a project title and apply for grant money and have, goals and action items. And I think we're trying to do that in a sense to keep some momentum and the conversations going, but also be really careful not to sort of get so focused on that, and not do things that we might regret or consider to be unethical. But it is really challenging, especially not having a tribal community to work with.
Yeah, and I think that this is a good example of how, the field is changing in a lot of ways. And we've talked about this a lot on the show over the last couple of years, but just, the challenges in being ethical, and continuing to be archaeologists and continuing to study this region and tell meaningful stories about the past. So I think that probably this project and the work that you've been doing and the collaborations you formed are are going to be of interest to a lot of people who are trying to find their way forward in, what is really a quickly changing landscape of anthropological work. So I guess just to kind of situate us before we get into talking about various aspects of the project, what can you tell our audience about the Quinnipiac homelands, the human history of this area, and the cultural heritage that we have to date?
Yeah, I guess I could get us started there. So, a basic fact that we certainly know is that, like in much of the rest of the state, people have been living and flourishing in the Quinnipiac River Valley for probably at least 11,500 or 12,000 years. The oldest sites in Connecticut are around that age, and there's some material culture evidence even in some of these legacy collections we're going to be talking about that suggest there are sites of that antiquity in the Quinnipiac River Valley region. So that's about as long as people have lived anywhere in the Northeast. That's a really long time, and cultural trends over the course of those thousands of years match what we see around the state in a lot of ways. Hunter-gatherer groups of different cultural traditions moving in and out of the region, enormous complexity, different kinds of lithic traditions, pottery traditions, eventually agricultural traditions, everything you can imagine, all the depth and complexity you can imagine from any archaeological landscape. And then we, of course, get a better picture of what's happening in the region starting in the 17th century as we get historical documentation that arrives with settler colonialism as the English and the Dutch start to move into the region at that time period, and we learn a lot about the Quinnipiac themselves. I don't think we know very strongly how long the Quinnipiac as a specific extant political group was there, but they were the group that was around in that region at that pivotal time of the 1620s, 30s, and 40s, kind of broken up into smaller bands within different communities, and each of those groups interacted deeply with, for instance, Davenport and Eaton, the sort of founders of New Haven, or the Whitfield and the other founders of the Guilford colony, or so on and so forth. And so we get a little bit of historical documentation from that, but not a ton. Just like in any time period, that early time period, we don't have an enormous amount of information. So we really have to rely on the archaeology to learn about that as well. So that's really bringing it down to a 30-second nutshell. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on this.
One of the things that we found in creating the Dawnland Museum was the fact that we had to, unfortunately, because of lack of indigenous input, rely a lot on the documents associated with the colonial activity here in Connecticut, and as a result, we went to the agreements themselves, not only with the New Haven Agreement and then the 3 or 4 agreements that Montawese, the sachem from the North Haven area, made with the various English groups, and then, of course, the Guilford Menunketuk Agreement, to sort of get an idea as to where actually the people who the English called Quinnipiac were located along the shoreline area. Our best guess at this point is that they extended from roughly the Milford, West Haven area north as far as Cheshire and Wallingford and Meriden, and then all along the coastline to as far as possibly Clinton, though we're not really sure about that because of some of the documentation is not all that clear in that area. One of the significant documents that we did turn to was, however, the agreement with the New Haven colonists when they first came. And part of the agreement stated that the Quinnipiac could continue to utilize the area from what is now East Haven all the way to the Connecticut River. So that kind of makes us wonder exactly how far east the Quinnipiac were. And then the other thing is we have no idea how long the Quinnipiac were actually identified as Quinnipiac. However, the earliest identification was Adrian Block's map from 1614 when he identifies the people of the shoreline, central shoreline area centered around New Haven Harbor as the Quirpie, and which translated from Dutch into, I guess, Quinnipiac. So. But it's really a puzzle. I agree with Bill. Other than, the artifacts are fascinating from the point of view of the evolution of culture over thousands of years. But exactly who the Quinnipiac were and when they actually arrived and could identify themselves as such is another puzzle, which I guess I can get into a little bit later too.
So I think, it's a story that's pretty common across southern New England, right, where colonization is early and intense. And we do end up relying a lot on the historical documentation to understand what people were doing in these time periods. Then the other side of that is the archaeological record. But I think also, like many places in our region, a lot of the cultural materials, the material culture that you're dealing with is coming from collectors, avocational work, right? Little collections that have been collected over the last 150 or so years. Can you talk a little bit about that history of collecting and archaeology, either professional or avocational, in the region? Any of you?
Yeah, to keep it quite short, we've worked at Southern Connecticut for the last couple of years, a little bit of a partnership with the North Haven Historical Society, really heavily through one of my students, Anthony Gambardella, who's a really brilliant young archaeologist that actually over this table has gotten to know and love, and Anthony's a wonderful lithicist, stone tool guy, but he's really kind of led this project. And what I've learned there is the North Haven Historical Society has just this enormous collection of an incredible amount of material, mostly stone tools, but also pottery, ceramics, and anything else you can imagine. Again, dating back when I mentioned before that artifacts to 12,000 years ago, those come from that collection, and every time period between then and into the colonial era, even into the 17th, 18th, 19th century, is in that collection. And it almost all is just stuff that was donated by farmers, local farmers, who were collecting over the course of their careers. They were plowing fields, and the stuff just comes back, and they put it into a shoebox, and then, leave it to the Historical Society in their will, and then it just sat in a closet for 100 years. And until we sort of got involved in this, actually originally through Brian Jones and Nick Bellantoni, who had both kind of dabbled with them a little bit in the past, and somehow that's how I ended up getting involved with that. And what this has kind of led me to believe, and it's increasingly become a part of this group's goals, is this seems to be the norm rather than the outlier for historical societies and in organizations, institutions like that around the state. And that's an alarming thing. It's an exciting thing because this is amazing, the material culture that we could potentially study or make available. But it's alarming and overwhelming because it's how do we catalog that? How do we determine that none of that is potentially related to human remains and maybe needs to be repatriated, right? That's a huge ethical question that's really important to all of us to answer. How do we make that information available to researchers, but also potentially to Indigenous people who maybe want to learn about their own history directly, without the input, without a gatekeeper in the middle like one of us? Those questions have arisen. So that's one. It goes back at least that long, yeah.
Yeah, and just to kind of throw this out there, there is currently a working group in the state, Connecticut Humanities, OSA, SHPO, CHLO, which is something else now. I think it's Connecticut League of History Museums now.
Museums, yeah.
Yeah, and a few other organized state library where we're trying to start to tackle this question of all these little collections and all these places and what we can do to kind of help, facilitate some kind of, curation, inventory, organization, just making this stuff more organized and available, and even understanding what collectively we have in these collections. So, people are thinking about it, but I think it's going to be a long haul process to get anywhere productive with a lot of that stuff. And I know also, there's a lot of collectors, like you said, right? People who are just picking things up in fields or going out and walking fields and looking for artifacts in the traditional ways. There's also a long history of archaeological excavation in this part of the state. I don't know if any of you want to or can speak to that.
Well, I worked with Dr. John Pfeiffer in the late 80s through the 90s into the 2000s. He was based out of Old Lyme and at various points was an adjunct professor at Wesleyan University. We did a lot of excavations in the surrounding Essex area, for example, here, including on their town green and also in an area up behind the current Connecticut River Museum, and it was interesting in that in both these sites we found artifacts that dated back to about 8,000 years, which was really kind of exciting. All that material, I believe, ended up with the Connecticut River Museum, which I don't want to say anything necessarily negative, but what happens with these artifacts I've found through experience is that even in these, a museum can take them and sort of put them away and forget that they have them. And I think that's the case for a lot of these organizations, which is really sort of too bad. And things are well documented at the time. I'm not sure how if the documentation has survived, but this was a very active area at some point, certainly, whether it was the Nahantic, whether it was the Quinnipiac or their ancestors, we really can't tell at this point. We do know from the historical record by the time the English showed up in this area at Fort and built Fort Saybrook in 1635-36, the Nahantic had basically abandoned the Saybrook, Essex area and moved, consolidated themselves over on the other shore of in the Old Lyme area, and that was probably more due to the epidemic of smallpox than anything else at the time, and the reduction of their population. So we know that when Saybrook Fort was being built, though there were many Nahantic and Pequot and others coming and going, there were no established villages in this area. So
I'll jump in, although I'm certainly not an expert on local archaeology. I'm a student to it, but something that really struck me when I started to try to find out more about archaeological information related to the Quinnipiac was the long kind of history of amateur archaeology collaborations with archaeologists, like the state archaeologists. So this is like preaching to the choir to Sarah here, but I think the Archaeological Society of Connecticut and FOSA, the Bulletin, right there, even though a lot of these collections can feel from kind of a professional archaeological perspective sometimes like they're lacking in some information. On the other hand, I think in Connecticut there's maybe quite a bit more information for some of these this type of work than in other places in the country. I grew up in Florida and did archaeology in Florida, and that was a big question there, where there wasn't necessarily these kinds of collaborations. I also think it's interesting to think about historical societies and collections. I know a lot of these exist at the North Haven Historical Society. I know at the Branford Historical Society, there's these collections that are related to people's land, like so-and-so's farm or so-and-so's backyard. And that might be the most detailed spatial information that exists, but it's still spatial information. And I think it could be pieced together in really interesting ways, particularly for people learning about the land that they're living on, for kids, if it's appropriate to use those objects. So that's another thing that I think is interesting to throw in there.
Yeah. I would say also, too, just from my perspective, so at OSA, as we've talked about before, we hold the state's archaeological collections, right? We're the repository for the state. And several years ago, the Archaeological Society of Connecticut, and we did have a show about the history of that a couple of years ago, but there used to be basically different little regional societies, right, and they did a lot of archaeological work. Some of it, in collaboration with professional archaeologists, like Julia was saying, some of it guided by avocational archaeologists with a lot of experience. But one of the most active excavation groups was the Greater New Haven Archaeological Society. And several years ago, the Office of State Archaeology received many of their collections, which actually do have pretty decent documentation for the most part. There's maps, there's paperwork, you can actually reconstruct some of these sites in meaningful ways. And I think that, that's probably a lot of collections from there actually would be a part of the inventory that you're looking at, just so you have that information. But we do actually have some good documentation that goes along with that. And as you were saying, some of that stuff is also published in the bulletin. Yeah.
Oh, and I think related to that is this issue that we have where collectors, especially in the past, traded things and moved pieces around. We have legacy collections that we're working on that are actually part of larger sites out of state. And so they end up in these larger collections that Grandpa had, and then his grandchildren are like, we don't like rocks, and they donate them to places like the museum, like the Institute, and we get them and find out that they're connected to these much larger sites. And in relation to that as well is like the museum itself here in Washington at the Institute was founded by an archaeological society. So they have hundreds of digs between the late 60s and the mid 70s in Litchfield County. And we are the proprietors of that collection, and just trying to work your way through those, even having a staff and having a kind of catalog system that's a database that's on a computer, you're still looking at dozens and dozens and hundreds of hours. So it's kind of daunting in a sense, but it's a fun little mystery to find a piece. And I think Anthony actually had a piece from the Historical Society that you were working on, Bill, that actually matched a collection that we had in our collection, and we were very giddy when we were like, these match, and we were very excited. Where that collection is going to go, I don't know. It's about space as well to think about. So it's I know Sarah, I think you might have a question later on about legacy collections, because that's arisen as something that we've become such a central part of this, because all of these, I don't know, this term legacy collection really is this catch-all term that can mean all these different things, a historical society, but or something that's in the OSA database, old collections that have problems, we'll say, right? So like methodological challenges, and archaeologists have long really been reluctant to deal with these kinds of collections because it's hard. You don't have your lovely maps with your XYZs and your northings and your eastings, and you know exactly where everything came from, and you could do the most detailed stuff. But to Julia's point before, I really agree. Working with the North Haven collection, what we've learned is there's a lot more value there than we would have thought, research potential value, in that you can get decent spatial data, you can get things down to individual properties, and potentially learn a lot about town-wide. You have to think a little bit larger scale than the site specific, but there's still interesting research elements at play there. And but then the challenges are also interesting. And again, working with somebody like Anthony, who is this, he came to me with like the lithic skills of a 60-year-old weirdo. I don't know. He's been doing flint knapping since he was like 4 or something. You should have Anthony on the show. He'd be a riot. He's like simultaneously like 14 and 70 at the same time. And everybody here knows what I mean by that, if you know. Oh God, he's gonna be really embarrassed. We talked about him so much. But he found the same thing going through that collection, like just in the same box of all points that came from one property, 10% of them were just stuff from Michigan or Missouri or whatever, and he would be able to figure out which, and you have to pull those out. And it's just, how did those get in there? Well, people go to collection shows, they have friends, they trade, they bought them on eBay. Who knows, right? We don't really know, but those are challenges that I think really scare a lot of archaeologists. And you just need to be ready to deal with if you want to try and work with these collections.
So, I mean, you've talked about working with collections at the Institute. You talked about working with collections at the North Haven Historical Society. You had the collection that's donated. How else have you gone about trying to identify collections that would be relevant to this, to the Quinnipiac homelands? And where have you found them? How far and wide, I guess, would be another question.
I guess since I was just talking, I'll finish that off just by saying I think one place we need to be where we're going to find them is in the gray literature from cultural resource management. So CRM firms, that's been talked about on the show probably quite a lot, right? I'm sure, right? But those who aren't aware, the vast majority of archaeology done in the state is done by cultural resource management, private firms under legal responsibility. And New Haven is an area of great deal of infrastructure buildup. So there's probably an enormous amount of information that are in, what gets called gray literature, which is this stuff that sort of publishes reports, but not necessarily in academic spaces. And accessing those materials can be tricky, can be challenging. So I think that's a place we need to look. For my examples, like working at the Whitfield House, which maybe we'll talk about later, like that's a historical site. It's a settler colonial site from the 17th, 18th, 19th century. It has a pre-colonial component, and that could easily get overlooked because it's a very small percentage of the collection, but it's a significant one. So stuff like that as well. So looking at just kind of any kind of archaeology and expecting that you're going to probably find stuff that's relevant here.
And part of the project, when we initially started, were through some interns, Anthony from Southern being one, and another young lady named Naomi from Quinnipiac, put together a list and started contacting all libraries and historical societies and created a massive list and found a ton of things, essentially just asking them if they had any materials that they knew came from the local area, and they would send her pictures. They're like, we have all these rocks. What do we do?
Come help us.
Just like boxes of them. But they also had things like random 17th century land deeds. They're like, were not cared for at all in random folders, which is very cool, but also very worrisome. So it was a good start, and it's kind of our kind of like baseline list that we're going off of, and kind of expanding out from there. But yeah, it's basically just getting someone to cold call these places and visit them and ask, and then going to state records and going through CRM reports, which is fun.
But the upside of that is that we're working to get them all digitized now. So, in collaboration with SHPO, they should be far more accessible than they once were, and hopefully keyword searchable for the most part. Yes. Some of the really old typed ones might not work out, but the more recent ones, I think you should be able to at least, make a little bit more headway on.
One thing to add to that, I think as we started to do that, exploring like what libraries and historical societies had objects related to Quinnipiac homelands, we realized sort of the scale of the project. And that's something that we've kind of started of thinking of, like, this is not something that any of us could take on really individually or even as a crew, even if we devoted the rest of our lives to this, which we all have other pretty busy day jobs. So we've started to think about kind of community toolkits for, like, how do we take, for example, like Anthony, knows so much about lithics and particularly quartz flint napping, and a lot of the stuff in these collections kind of relates to that. Can we, come up with some models of, comparative collections that could be shared with a lot of the volunteers that are really dedicated? I can just talk about the Branford Historical Society. It's based on this small group of people who are totally in love with the land and the history, and they want to be able to look at what's in their collection, and providing ways for people to be able to look at what's in these collections in the local community. So it's kind of practical, but also has a community focus.
Yeah, and there's no other way to do it, I don't think, on this scale.
I agree with Julia. Since we've opened the Dawnland Museum, I'm amazed at how many representatives from these different historical societies and libraries have been coming to us, and their basic question is, how do we do this? What can we turn to? We don't know what to do. And I think Branford is a great example, and I've seen their collection as well, which is incredible. They have some really unique pieces, but they're overwhelmed. They have no idea. So I think the whole idea of creating some sort of toolkit to help them would be really beneficial. I mean, I was lucky enough, I'm retired from a history teacher and an archaeologist, and so I had time over 2 years to sort of document at the Dawnland Museum at least the items the artifacts that we wanted to at least display, but we have thousands of more, and as a volunteer, that's a bit of the overwhelming. And I know all these historical societies are in the same situation, so I agree that toolkit's going to be important.
Yeah, so I do want to spend some time towards like a little while talking about the museum and how you pulled it together and all of that. But before we get into that, I guess we raised the question in the beginning. Since there is no formal Quinnipiac tribal group, how have you worked to kind of navigate this, and how have you worked to kind of find or collaborate with Indigenous partners in this endeavor? Or has it even been possible to do so? I guess I'm just curious about because again, I think a lot of people are desperately trying to figure out how to do this the right way, right? And everybody wants kind of a roadmap for doing this in a way that's ethical, but also, productive. So if you have any, you can share your experiences and your challenges. I think that would be really of interest to a lot of people.
I could start that off, I guess. Over the last 2 to 3 years, as we realized that we were going to be building this museum, I began a process of going to as many communities as possible where the Quinnipiac had once lived and speaking, telling them about the story of the Quinnipiac. And it was amazing to realize how few people in our region really understand anything about who the Quinnipiac were, let alone whether or not they were an indigenous group. And part of my goal also was to try to make contact with anybody who might be of that type of ancestry. And of course, working with Julia and Daniel, her student, reaching out to different groups, including the Brothertown people, up to this point has not been beneficial. We even have last names of individual Quinnipiac people who migrated to Brothertown, and there are descendants there with those last names, yet they don't want to get involved, which is another issue, I think. In speaking to some of the indigenous people in Connecticut, I started to realize that publicly coming forward is uncomfortable for cultural reasons. And especially, particularly maybe in the atmosphere that we're currently living in. But that's also one challenge. But we also, we had a lot of articles written in the local New Haven Register about our museum, and the local Shoreline newspapers and Connecticut Insider, for example, explaining about one of our goals was to try to bring people of Quinnipiac ancestry into our project, and as of right now, no one has come forward. So there is another whole chapter associated with the Quinnipiac, which I don't think we'll have time to get into today. But that's in terms of a group that sort of created themselves as the Quinnipiac in the late '90s and early 2000s. So. And I'm not sure if that might have soured some people, but anyway, it's an interesting process of trying to locate who these people are. And also, we tell visitors at the museum, can you tell me who was your ancestor 10 generations ago? And of course,
it's a big ask.
Hey, I got my Irish ones down up to 6, so I'm feeling pretty good. So,
I think we do place a lot of expectation on people, to be excited about these projects and want to collaborate and want to get involved, and that's our thing, not necessarily other people's things, who might have day jobs as like accountants or whatever and just don't have any interest in doing this.
I mean, sort of Jim mentioned, like, this is a politically charged issue in a lot of ways, right? From the modern groups who have sort of claimed Quinnipiac heritage in some ways that were quite intense in recent decades, to just trying to piece together the history, because we know, the Quinnipiac after the 1630s and the founding of the earliest colonies in Connecticut, the Quinnipiac were already a pretty small group, just numbers wise, it seems like, and there's a lot of movement after that. People start to move in with other native communities, the different bands of the Quinnipiac, which seem to be quite sovereign and separate from one another in the 1630s, start to kind of band together. There's a kind of quasi-reservation in New Haven on the East Shore that sticks around for a century or so and then disbands. And then the Brotherton movement has been mentioned a couple times. So there's some historical evidence that some Quinnipiac people might have moved west with the Brotherton movements, which were sort of Christian Indian praying villages who were moving to places like Ohio and stuff like that to kind of found communities, hopefully like away from as much as possible away from the overbearing arms of the state as much as they could, right? So it's tied up in all those stories of survival and survivance and politics and archaeological ethics over the last several decades, as Sarah mentioned before, has evolved, and there's been just enormous amounts of writing about how to do this, how to do collaboration, how to work with Indigenous people, and it's largely revolved around the situation that most archaeologists find themselves in, which is working in places where there are lots of extant Indigenous communities with federal recognition or state recognition, and there's not nearly as much about how to try and navigate this in places where that doesn't exist, but still wanting earnestly to do it, to try and do that collaboration. So
I think another tricky aspect of this, and this is something that I've really come to understand my own ignorance over the last couple of years as we've done more and more research on the Hollister site and the Wongunk and things like that, and really starting to delve into the documents of 17th century Indigenous history here in Connecticut, is that we talk all the time about how, Native people had all these relationships based on kin and, intermarriage and people going back and forth through communities, but like they really, really were tied to all these different communities, like in the Connecticut River Valley, Montouise, for example. His family is Wongunk, right? These people are marrying into all these different communities, creating these ties as a buffer in many ways against what's happening with colonialism and as a way to create kind of stronger linked communities, which then become very complicated when there's conflict, right? Whose side are you on? Who can you trust? All that stuff. Thinking about King Philip's War and everything that we've been dealing with at the Hollister site. So I think that, even the identification of who is a Quinnipiac descendant or what that even means, I think, because of all of these connections between different groups can be very complicated. And that's just not this case. That's just, Indigenous history in the region. So it's hard sometimes. We almost need labels to organize things, but also they're almost impossible.
Some of those labels just might be just wrong. They just might not be. Those were in many cases English impositions, right? And so,
right.
Who are we to try and use that to structure people's politics today? It's pretty hard.
One thing to add to that too, and this is something that I really learned in the process of reaching out to Brotherton, was conversations that we had with their tribal historic preservation officer, and also there was a small group doing research on genealogies and kind of doing the work. You mentioned, Jim, so certain people in the tribe are really, trying to trace ancestry. But what they shared with us was that, part of creating Brotherton was about having a different identity, right? It's all these different groups, coming together, and that was more important than, keeping sort of connected to, say, Mohegan identity or Quinnipiac identity or Wongunk identity, whether those even existed to begin with. And it was a real lesson for myself and my student in what are we asking for here? And another thing too, I think at the time when we reached out to them, we didn't have a real specific ask. It was like, don't you guys want to help us? Do what? What exactly do you just want some Indigenous friends here? What's going on? And I think, that was in the kind of the early days of all of us getting to know each other. And I think we are now at a place where we have a little bit more of an idea of things that we could work on and things that we could use, Indigenous consultation on. And this would be a really good time to go back to Brotherton, and because they did say, look, we've got a newsletter, we've got a Facebook page, once you guys have some stuff, we can send it out to our community. It doesn't mean that people will be interested necessarily, but, we're happy to sort of share that. So I think we're, through this sort of organic process, I also think relationship building is hard and happens slowly.
Yeah, and it should, right? Because you have
yeah.
to build trust, and you can't just be, we're here to ask things from you.
Right, exactly.
And not give anything. I mean, and I think that sometimes is the way it ends up working out, or it seems maybe at the outset. So it is a long process, right? And relationships need to be built. So we only have 15 minutes left, and I want to talk a little bit about just some of the ways that you've shared some of the work that you've done, and particularly I think with the exhibits that have been put together. I also want to give Jim the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the Dawnland Museum, which I still haven't had a chance to go to, but I'd really like to visit this year. So I guess, can you talk to us about how you developed your exhibits and how you've kind of worked within this complicated framework to tell a meaningful story?
Oh, okay. Well, one of our problems, as you folks have already mentioned, is the fact that all we had to work with really was a collection of artifacts that had been gathered. We knew from areas where the Quinnipiac had once lived by a gentleman from Stony Creek. His name was Gordon Brainerd. He was an avid collector. In his later years, I tried to work with him a little bit archaeologically. Did not work out well. He liked to shovel, not his trowel, and it was an interesting process to go through. But part of the issue was that although we had some collections where they were identified by at least where they were from, for example, the Thimble Islands or Chaffinch Island in Guilford, the majority of the artifacts had no provenance whatsoever. And so the issue became, how are we going to deal with these? In his later years, I would ask him, Gordon, I try to get him to identify where these things would come from, and of course he would always be a little hesitant, but he would say, they're all Quinnipiac. And from what I can tell, we have, other than a few outliers, we do have things that are indigenous to Connecticut. So that was one of the issues. And then our issue then became, okay, how are we going to work with these artifacts? And then we realized very early on that we wanted to do more than just display these artifacts and tell the story of that. We wanted to tell the story of the indigenous people of the shoreline area from really the end of the Ice Age until when the Quinnipiacs, we call it a diaspora, the Quinnipiac diaspora, where they kind of move off with other groups. And so we wanted to use the artifacts only from the point of view of how they could show the different time periods by which people lived ecologically. So one of our main exhibits deals with what was the environment like during the Paleo time, the Archaic time, etc., and use the artifacts to show that and talk about the differences in terms of in terms of the technology changes over time and why the technology changed. Also, we worked to try to show as much as we could within limited space about spiritual beliefs and life ways prior to the arrival of the Dutch and the English. But part of our problem was we wanted to tell the story in a sensitive, culturally sensitive and respectful way. And that's where we started to run into trouble. We reached out to both the Manchitucket Pequots and the Mohegan, and they were not interested at all in helping us. Their attitude was sort of, those people are gone and they're not, and why are you bothering, that kind of thing, which I was really sort of surprised. We also reached out to a couple of other groups that were not interested in advising us until we came across a good friend of mine by the name of David Brule, who is a Niantic elder, and he's been involved with the group with the Niantics, who are actually, they've now reconstituted themselves as a tribal group, and he's on their council. He agreed to be one of our advisors, which was really terrific. We also then wanted to tell the story through of the indigenous people through the voices of people who exist now. And from that point of view, we were able to contact a number of really talented artists. Three in particular are Wampanoags, who created original artwork that helped tell the story of the life ways and the spiritual beliefs of the Quinnipiac people. And then we also worked with poetry, Indigenous poetry, to help tell the story, and blessings from current people, things of that nature, so that when people come in, they're not, the artifacts aren't the focus. The focus is really on the story of the Indigenous people of the region, and we've got tremendous feedback from people who both who know what they're looking at and people who had no idea the Quinnipiac existed. The biggest challenge, however, is as a nonprofit organization, which the Dudley Farm is, how are we going to actually, number one, build a building, and then number two, pull this off? And luckily we were able to obtain a very generous grant from a local foundation and a grant through the Connecticut Humanities to work with people from Peabody Museum to help design and create our exhibits. So we're really very happy about what we were able to achieve. The issue, once again, though, was that we still have this incredible collection of artifacts that that we are not displaying and probably never will, but yet we still know that they're valuable in terms of a better understanding of the Quinnipiac people in general. So the other part of the museum, which is very powerful when people visit, is that we used a whole section of the museum to tell the story of once the Dutch arrived and then the English. We focus a little bit on the arrival of the Dutch in particular and how that changed things, especially the impact on the Quinnipiac people, because the fort that the Dutch built on Indian Neck in Brantford, based on the artifacts they did between 1550 and 1620, was right next to where the village of Totucket was. And one of the things that's kind of exciting from our point of view is the fact that the Quinnipiac were the first native people in Connecticut to live side by side Europeans, at least as far as we know at this point. So, but anyway, it's a great little museum. We're open every Saturday starting in April from 10 to 2, and then once May, June, July, and the summer comes, we'll be open every Saturday and Sunday. And I encourage people to come visit simply because it's a refreshing look at Indigenous people and in the region. So.
Great. I know we have a few minutes left, but do you want to talk a little bit about the exhibits that you've been working on with students in North Haven Historical Society? Or?
Yeah, we've got a couple of things going on that are really relevant to this. As I've been on the show a few times before, and I've talked about my main research projects is with the Henry Whitfield State Museum in Guilford, and Jim just mentioned the Connecticut Humanities, which is a phenomenal organization, and we actually have gotten a couple of grants from them now to help the museum, which is a state museum, so they do have some structure, but as you might imagine with any state organization, they don't have a lot of money. So being able to get some grants to help we actually ran a temporary exhibit. It'll probably be open for the foreseeable future. If you want to come by Wednesday through Sunday, the museum is open to come check it out, called History Beneath Our Feet, which is mostly student-driven, student-built, and focused on the archaeology at the site. But then we got a larger grant just recently from CT Humanities as well to try and do a reinterpretation of the actual exhibits in the house itself, and that with the goal of expanding the story in the museum is very focused on that 1639 Henry Whitfield, as it was. And it's a 130 plus year old museum. That's not surprising. But the goal is to try and expand that story using the half century of archaeology that's been done there, as well as historical research and a lot of the things that Jim was talking about too, trying to bring in oral histories and stories and modern voices, contemporary voices, to try and expand that story out to talk about both the deep Indigenous history, the Quinnipiac history going back thousands of years that we've found on the site, as well as the more recent history. So the going up into the 20th century, a more sort of working class story of people who lived in the house in more recent centuries. So, and all of that's been very student driven and in a great way, and with some collaboration with NAHAC, which is an organization of the tribes in Connecticut, and Acamod as well, who I think Jim somebody mentioned Agabon earlier too, which is a great like educational, Indigenous-driven and educational institution. One thing we found that's really helpful, this last thing I'm going to say, is we've been. I think a theme that's emerged today is working with Indigenous people can be challenging because you're asking them to do a lot for free. And I think one thing we can try and do more as archaeologists is ask them not to do it for free by having money to give them. So like when you're asking people to share their knowledge with you, that's labor, right? You're asking them to share, to do the work of doing that for you. So, and granting agencies are increasingly more willing to give money for that sort of thing. So that could be a thing in your future, try and put a little money into that grant to do a little collaboration so that you can actually, to compensate folks for that. So. That's all I got.
About your students' exhibit?
Do we have time?
Yeah.
A couple minutes. Well, I guess one of the things, like right now my students are working with the Brantford Historical Society on a very small, like a little part of a room in the Harrison House in Brantford. But one thing that we've done for several years actually is work in collaboration with Paul and the collections at the Institute, as well as actually Bill and Sarah. You guys were kind of involved with the material that we found at the North Haven site on Quinnipiac's campus. And we have done a very small exhibit in the library at Quinnipiac University as part of Native American Heritage Month as part of a class project. And that's been a really interesting exercise in how to think through the ethics of working with legacy collections and actually new collections within a classroom setting with students. At Quinnipiac, students, we have an anthro minor, but they're not going to become archaeologists. So it's really what I bring to my classroom is like, how do we educate students to be thoughtful citizens for whatever lands they end up being on, occupying, right? And how to be thoughtful and curious about that. So I think that's another potential of using archaeological legacy collections is thinking about, where appropriate, how can outreach and class projects work. And that's been, I think, really, really wonderful at the university.
That's great.
I just had one more thing I wanted to bring up, which we had sort of talked about earlier, and that is what do we do with people who come to us with a shoebox? I mean, it's at some points we're almost overwhelmed with people who are calling and saying, "We have my grandfather's blah blah blah," and I try to ask, well, where are they from? Well, occasionally we'll get an actual farm, for example, so we know where that was. But a lot of them are just things that are scattered all over. But people, if we have to start to think about how are we going to, we can't let them go. So the issue is, how do we take these things? We have a nice attic in our new museum, which we can certainly fill up. But what is that? I mean, no, that just moves it from somebody's closet to our attic. I think that that's not necessarily going to work. So, but I think that's a major, because there are a lot of people out there who are willing and wanting to find a home for these things. And I know, Paul had mentioned the fact that that's been an issue with you folks for a while.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something as an organization, as a group, we may have to.
Mm-hmm.
I think the collections crisis sounds like a future episode, Sarah.
Oh, yeah, we could talk about that for days.
That's a whole other thing.
I think we're out of time, just about. So if everybody wants to just go around the room and maybe talk about how people could get in touch with you or find out some more information, so they can send you their shoeboxes.
So again, I'm Bill Farley. I'm at Southern Connecticut State University. If you Google me with those two things, you'll find me on various locations. Or Archaeology Tube on YouTube.
And I'm Paul Wegner. You can find me at the Institute for American Indian Studies, iasmuseum.org.
Jim Powers with the Quinnipiac Dawnland Museum at the Dudley Farm Museum. www.dudleyfarm.com is the easiest way to get to me.
And Julia Giblin at Quinnipiac University.
If you're interested in FOSA, please look at our website, fosa-ct.org. We have a lot of great stuff out there.
And the Office of State Archaeology at osa.uconn.edu and on Facebook.